The dreams of a lonely man can be more dangerous than any loaded revolver. Shelby Mitchell watched the horizon line, where the sky met the parched land of her ranch. Sweat ran down his thin face as he mended the fence that cattle had torn down the night before. His small, calloused hands worked with precision, each movement calculated by the experience of someone who had spent his entire life fighting against the unforgiving nature of Arizona. The farmer had built his property with his own hands after the war, when he returned home to find that he had no home to return to. The desert had become his refuge, a place where a man of short stature could grow through hard work and determination. He was just over 6 feet tall, but his reputation in the region was gigantic. No one doubted Shelby Mitchell's courage or her committed word. The nights were the worst. When the work was done, and the silence of the desert engulfed the world, Shelby would sit on the wooden porch of her simple home and let her mind wander. He was 38 years old and had never known true love. The women of the city treated him with respect, but he noticed how his eyes searched for taller, more imposing men. It was on one of those lonely nights that he began to dream about her, a delicate woman with soft hands and a voice sweet as honey. In her dreams, she wore flowery dresses and had golden hair that danced in the wind. She was small and fragile, someone who would need his protection, someone who would see in him the hero he always wanted to be. The dream repeated itself, night after night, always in more detail. He could smell her soft scent, hear her crystalline laughter echoing through the empty house. Shelby would wake up with her heart racing and her eyes moist, knowing that she would go back to sleep, only to find her again. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, brought by old Tom, who was delivering mail in the region. The paper was thick, and the envelope bore the stamp of a San Francisco marriage agency. Shelby had sent her photo and a letter describing her property months ago, in a moment of despair and loneliness. "Dear Mr. Mitchell," the letter read in elegant handwriting, "I accept your proposal of marriage. I arrive at Tombstone Station on the 15th of August on the 2 o'clock train in the afternoon. Sincerely, Margaret Thompson." Shelby's hands trembled as she held the paper. Finally, his dreams would come true. He had 3 weeks to prepare, 3 weeks to transform his rustic home into a home fit for a refined lady. He ran to the cracked mirror in his room and examined his reflection. His face was sunburned, his hair unkempt, his beard unshaven. He would have to become the man she deserved. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Shelby painted the house, repaired the windows, bought new furniture in town. He ordered a fine dress for herself, delicate fabrics, imported perfumes. Every penny she had saved was invested in preparing for Margaret's arrival. On the eve of the scheduled date, Shelby could barely sleep. He got up before dawn, took a shower, shaved carefully, and put on his best suit. Her shoes shone like mirrors, and her hair was combed with ointment. He looked in the mirror and saw a man transformed by love and hope. The drive to Tombstone took 2 hours under the scorching sun. Shelby arrived at the station an hour early and waited on the wooden platform, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked on the way. His heart beat like a war drum as he watched the tracks stretch out until they disappeared over the horizon. The train's whistle sounded in the distance, a high-pitched sound that cut through the hot afternoon air. A cloud of black smoke appeared first, followed by the locomotive slowly approaching the station. Shelby straightened his jacket, checked to see if his tie was in place, and took a deep breath. The train stopped with a metallic creak that echoed across the nearly empty platform. A few people got off the wagons, a fat merchant, a family with small children, 2 cowboys tired from the journey. Shelby watched every face, looking for the delicate woman of her dreams. It was then that she appeared at the door of the car, and Shelby's world fell apart. Margaret Thompson measured almost 2 meters tall. Shelby stood paralyzed on the platform, the bouquet of wildflowers trembling in her small hands. The woman who got off the train was the complete opposite of everything he had imagined. She wore a navy blue dress that could barely contain her imposing frame, and her broad shoulders blocked the sunlight coming in through the carriage door. But there was something about her movements that belied her first impression. Margaret descended the steps of the train with surprising delicacy, as if she were afraid of breaking something. Her large hands held the skirt of her dress carefully, and when her feet touched the platform, she looked around with a shyness that didn't match her imposing stature. Her eyes met his, and Shelby saw something that completely baffled him. Margaret Thompson had the sweetest and most vulnerable eyes she had ever seen. They were blue as the desert sky at dawn, and they carried a deep sadness that he recognized immediately. It was the same sadness I saw in the mirror every morning. She approached slowly, each step calculated so as not to draw unnecessary attention. The other people at the station were discreetly looking at the giant woman and the small man who were now facing each other. Margaret stopped a few yards away, as if expecting a rejection. Shelby watched her face more closely. Despite her intimidating size, Margaret had delicate features. Her lips were thin and pink, her eyebrows neatly drawn, and small freckles dotted her flushed cheeks. She wore her brown hair tied up in a simple bun, but a few unruly locks escaped and danced in the warm afternoon wind. The silence stretched between them for long seconds. Margaret looked down at her own hands, which held a small leather suitcase. Shelby noticed that she was shivering slightly, despite the scorching heat. Her vulnerability was as palpable as her own surprise. Slowly, as if approaching an injured animal, Shelby took a step toward her. Margaret looked up, and he saw there a silent supplication. She knew it wasn't what he expected. He knew that he had lied by omission in the correspondence. She knew he had every right to turn his back and leave her alone on that dusty platform. But Shelby didn't turn around. Instead, he held out the bouquet of wildflowers toward her. Margaret's hands trembled as she received him, and for a moment, both hands touched. Her skin was surprisingly soft, and Shelby felt something strange happen on her chest. It wasn't what he had planned, it wasn't what he had dreamed of, but there was something there that he couldn't name. Margaret held the flowers to her chest and closed her eyes for a moment, as if she were memorizing that moment. When she opened them again, there were tears around the edges, but also something that could be hope. The trip back to the ranch was made in silence. Margaret sat next to Shelby in the buggy, her knees bent awkwardly to fit into the small space. She watched the barren landscape with genuine interest, as if she were seeing beauty where others saw only desolation. Shelby watched her discreetly as she guided the horses down the dusty trail. Margaret had a stooped posture, as if she spent her life trying to make herself smaller than she was. He recognized the gesture because he did the opposite. He always tried to make himself bigger, to stretch his spine, to lift his chin. Both were prisoners of their own bodies, fighting against what they could not change. When they arrived at the ranch, Margaret got out of the buggy as gently as before and stood in front of the simple wooden house. Shelby saw through her eyes, a modest building, surrounded by dry land and a few sturdy trees. It was not the palace he had described in his letters, but it was honest. Margaret walked to the porch and ran her hand over the wood of the fence, testing its solidity. Shelby realized that she was appraising not only the property, but trying to understand the man who had built it. There was something meticulous about the way she observed every detail, as if she were putting together a puzzle in her mind. That first night, Shelby prepared a bed on the sofa in the living room and offered his room to Margaret. She accepted with a nod, but before she left, she stood in the doorway for a long moment. Her eyes met his again, and Shelby saw gratitude there. Gratitude for not having run away, for having received her in his home, for having treated her with kindness when he expected rejection. Shelby stayed up all night, listening to the soothing sounds coming from the room. Margaret moved carefully even in the dark, as if she was afraid of breaking something. He imagined how difficult it must be for her to navigate a world built for lesser people, how every gesture must be calculated so as not to cause discomfort to others. For the first time since seeing her at the station, Shelby allowed herself to really look at the situation. Margaret was not the woman of his dreams, but there was something about her that intrigued him. There was a quiet force behind his shyness, a genuine gentleness that he rarely encountered, and there was also a loneliness that echoed his own, a hunger for connection that transcended appearances. When dawn painted the sky orange, Shelby made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Shelby decided to meet the woman behind the imposing stature. The next morning, he knocked gently on the bedroom door and left a tray of coffee and fresh bread on the floor. Margaret opened the door a few minutes later when he was already in the kitchen. She had found one of her aprons hanging from a nail and wore it tied around her waist, even though it was too small for her. The simple gesture touched something in Shelby's heart that he didn't know existed. Margaret moved around the kitchen as if she were dancing a careful waltz with the surrounding space. She tested each floorboard before putting on her body weight, checked the height of the shelves before approaching, lowered her head even when it wasn't necessary. It was a survival choreography that she had perfected over the years, but there was something more. When Margaret thought he wasn't looking, she relaxed a little. His movements became more natural, more graceful. Shelby realized she had skilled hands. She fixed a loose pantry door hinge, adjusted a rocking chair, arranged cookware with an efficiency that betrayed experience. During the first few days, they established a quiet routine. Shelby would wake up before dawn to tend the cattle and make the necessary repairs to the property. Margaret naturally took over the care of the house, cooking meals that filled the small building with scents Shelby had never experienced. She knew how to season meat so that it was tender, turn simple vegetables into tasty dishes, make bread that melted in your mouth. But it was in the unplanned moments that Shelby began to truly see her. One afternoon, he returned early from the pasture to find her in the backyard, kneeling next to an injured chicken. Margaret held the animal with impressive delicacy, her enormous hands working with surgical precision to clean a cut on the wing. She mumbled soft words to the chicken, who remained strangely calm in her arms. That night, Shelby saw Margaret on the porch, stargazing with an expression of pure wonder. She was sitting on the wooden step, her knees bent against her chest in a position that made her look smaller, more vulnerable. When a shooting star streaked across the sky, she brought her hands to her chest as if making a wish. It was then that Shelby began to understand. Margaret Thompson wasn't just a big woman in a misleading cover letter. She was someone who had spent her life hiding, diminishing herself, apologizing for taking up space in the world. And there was a tragic beauty to this constant struggle between her gentle nature and the way the world perceived her. One morning, Shelby woke up to the sound of a hammer coming from the barn. He rushed to investigate and found Margaret repairing the door that had come off the hinges the week before. She had found the tools and worked with a skill that surprised him. His hands, which seemed clumsy holding delicate cups, handled the hammer with dexterity. Margaret stopped when she realized he was watching, his face flushing with embarrassment. She began to apologize with gestures as if she had done something wrong, but Shelby approached and examined her work. The door was perfectly aligned, the screws placed precisely. He nodded approvingly, and the smile that lit up Margaret's face was like the sunrise after a long night. That afternoon they worked together for the first time. Shelby showed her how to fix the west pasture fence, and Margaret revealed that she had an instinctive understanding of construction that rivaled his. They communicated through gestures and looks, developing a language of their own that did not need words. But it was during a sandstorm that everything changed between them. The afternoon was clear when the dark clouds appeared on the horizon. Shelby recognized the signs and rushed to bring the cattle closer to the house. Margaret helped him without hesitation, running through the pasture with an agility that belied his size. When the storm hit, they barely made it to the barn before being swallowed up by the wall of sand and wind. The barn was small and dark, lit only by the lightning that cut through the sky. Shelby and Margaret took shelter among the hay bales, the roar of the storm drowning out any sound around. Margaret was shivering, not from cold, but from fear. Shelby realized that she was terrified of storms. Without thinking, he walked over and put his hand on her arm. Margaret looked at him in surprise but did not turn away. Slowly, she relaxed under his touch, and Shelby felt something fundamental transform inside her chest. It was not pity or sympathy. It was something deeper, more true. During the hours they spent waiting for the storm to pass, Shelby watched Margaret in the dim light of lightning. She had closed her eyes and controlled her breathing, fighting her fear with quiet determination. There was a quiet courage in her that he admired, an inner strength that had nothing to do with physical size. When the storm finally passed and they came out of the barn, Margaret stopped at the door and looked at him. His eyes were different, as if a barrier had been removed. For the first time since she had arrived, she didn't seem to be apologizing for existing. That night, while Margaret was preparing dinner, Shelby noticed that she hummed softly. It was a sweet, melancholy melody that echoed through the house like a promise of better things to come. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to wake up every day to that music filling his house. For the first time in weeks, Shelby didn't dream of the delicate woman in her fantasies. Instead, she dreamed of big, gentle hands, blue eyes full of vulnerability, and a presence that filled all the empty spaces in her life. Love arrived as unexpectedly as rain in the desert. Shelby woke up one September morning with the certainty that something had changed inside him. Margaret was in the kitchen as usual, preparing breakfast. But this time, when she turned and smiled at him, Shelby felt her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with surprise or nervousness. It was something deeper, truer than any dream he had ever had. Over the next few weeks, Shelby began to pay attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way Margaret folded the clothes with perfect care, leaving each piece aligned as if it were a work of art. How she spoke to the farm animals, using a motherly tone that revealed an immense heart behind the imposing structure. How her eyes lit up when she discovered wildflowers growing among the rocks of the desert. Margaret has also changed. She began to move around the house with more confidence, no longer testing every move as if she were walking on thin ice. His laughter became more frequent, a musical sound that transformed the atmosphere of the house. She grew some unruly curls around her face, which danced in the warm afternoon wind and made her look years younger. It was during the repair of the roof that Shelby finally understood the true nature of her feelings. He had gone upstairs to replace some tiles damaged by the last storm when he lost his balance and slipped. Margaret appeared out of nowhere to support him, her strong hands catching him in the air as if he weighed nothing. For a moment they stood like this, Shelby in Margaret's arms, both of them gasping from sudden closeness. His eyes met hers, and this time, neither of them looked away. There was something in the air between them, an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm looming on the horizon. Margaret gently placed him on the floor, but her hands remained on his shoulders for a few seconds longer than necessary. Shelby saw something in her eyes that made him tremble. It wasn't just gratitude or kindness anymore. It was desire, vulnerable and scared, but unmistakably real. That night, they sat on the porch as they had done many other times, but the silence between them was laden with unexpressed possibilities. Margaret watched the stars with the same expression of wonder as always, but Shelby watched Margaret. He studied her delicate profile against the night sky, the gentle curve of her neck, the way her lips curved slightly upward even at rest. When a gust of wind made Margaret shudder, Shelby moved without thinking. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, his small hands briefly touching the warm skin of her neck. Margaret turned to thank him, and suddenly they were very close, breathing the same air. It was Margaret who leaned in first. She moved her face toward him with a painful hesitation, as if expecting to be rejected at any moment. But Shelby didn't back down. Instead, he raised his hand and gently touched her face, guiding her closer. The kiss was unlike anything Shelby had imagined in her romantic dreams. It wasn't delicate or fragile. It was intense, charged with all the pent-up loneliness and desire they both carried. Margaret kissed as if she were thirsty, and he was the first drop of water after years in the desert. There was a hunger in her that matched his perfectly. When they parted, Margaret put her hands to her face, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what had happened. Shelby saw tears starting to form in the corners of her eyes, and for a terrible moment, she thought she had made a terrible mistake. But then Margaret smiled. It was a smile unlike any other, not shy or cautious, but radiant with pure happiness. She touched her own lips as if she were trying to preserve the sensation, and Shelby knew she had found something she didn't even know she was looking for. The following days were a revelation for both. Shelby found that Margaret had strong opinions on everything, from how best to plant corn to local politics. She read voraciously. She had a small but well-chosen collection of books in her suitcase and could discuss literature with a passion that surprised him. Margaret revealed dreams of opening a school for children in the area, using her formal education for something more than just survival. Margaret in turn discovered that Shelby had a poet's soul behind the rustic appearance. He knew the name of every desert plant, could predict the weather by the shape of the clouds, and had an intuitive understanding of the land that revealed years of careful observation. When he talked about his plans for the farm, his eyes sparkled with a passion that made her see beyond the small man to the visionary he truly was. They began to work together on all aspects of the farm. Margaret proved to have a mind for business that perfectly complemented Shelby's practicality. She reorganized finances, planned improvements to the property, and even suggested expanding into horse breeding, taking advantage of a pasture that Shelby had never considered useful. But it was on a warm October afternoon that Shelby finally realized that she had fallen completely in love. He returned from the pasture to find Margaret in the kitchen, preparing preserves with the last fruits of the season. She wore one of her simple dresses, her hair tied up in a practical way, and hummed that sweet melody that had become the soundtrack to her new life. When she saw him at the door, her face lit up with genuine joy at seeing him. In that moment, Shelby knew that no matter what the future brought, he wanted to spend every remaining day of his life seeing that smile. Margaret approached him, wiping her hands on her apron, and without warning, bent down to kiss him again. This time, there was no hesitation or fear, just love, pure and true, growing between them like a promise of happiness that neither had dared to imagine possible. The wedding took place on a golden November morning, when the desert was painted in the softest colors of the year. Shelby woke up before dawn, not because of her work on the farm, but because she couldn't sleep anymore from anticipation. Today was the day Margaret Thompson would become Margaret Mitchell, and he would finally have the family he had always wanted, even if it was completely different from anything he had imagined. The pastor arrived from Tombstone in a dusty buggy, accompanied by Tom, the letter deliverer, who would serve as a witness. It was a simple ceremony, but Shelby didn't mind. What mattered was the woman standing next to him on the porch of the house they had made home together. Margaret wore a light blue dress that she had sewn herself, taking advantage of fabrics Shelby had bought in town. She had left a few loose curls around her face and held a small bouquet of desert flowers. When she smiled at him during the ceremony, Shelby felt as if the sun had risen twice that day. The pastor's words echoed through the dry morning air, but Shelby barely heard them. He was mesmerized by Margaret's eyes, which shone with tears of happiness. When it came time to exchange the rings, 2 simple rings he had ordered to be made in the city, their hands trembled with excitement. The kiss that sealed the union was different from the others they had shared. It was a kiss of promise, of commitment, of 2 hearts that had finally found their place in the world. When they parted, Margaret wrapped her arm around Shelby's shoulders, and for the first time, neither of them worried about the height difference. The party was small, but memorable. Margaret had prepared a feast with the farm's own produce, and Tom brought a bottle of whiskey that he had saved for special occasions. They toasted under the stars, laughing at stories Tom told about his years delivering letters in the area. When the guests left and they were left alone, Shelby and Margaret sat on the porch as they did every night. But this time, Margaret didn't sit down on the separate step. She snuggled up next to him on the swing they'd built together, her head resting on his shoulder. The following months brought a happiness that neither of them had known before. Margaret opened her school in a room they had built especially for this purpose, and soon had 8 children from the area learning to read and write. Shelby expanded horse breeding as she had suggested, and found that she had a natural talent for training the animals. But it was the following spring that the real magic happened. Margaret was working in the garden she had planted behind the house when she called Shelby with an urgency in her voice that startled him. He ran to her, fearing that something was wrong. Margaret was kneeling among the vegetable beds, her hands covered in dirt, her eyes shining with excitement. She pointed to a small area she had specially prepared, where small green shoots emerged from the dark earth. It was impossible. Nothing grew in that part of the desert. The land was too dry, too hard. But here they were, little green miracles defying all the laws of nature. Margaret had found a way to make life flourish, where everyone said it was impossible. She had mixed organic compost with the sand, created an irrigation system using rainwater, and planted seeds she had brought from San Francisco. Shelby knelt beside her, gently touching one of the small plants. It was a tomato, still tiny, but indisputably alive and growing. Margaret had transformed a barren piece of desert into a thriving garden, just as she had transformed her lonely life into a true love story. That evening, they celebrated the small miracle of the garden with an intimacy that had grown naturally between them over the months. Shelby discovered that true love had nothing to do with size, appearance, or broken expectations. It had to do with 2 people who completed each other in ways they didn't even know they needed to be completed. Years later, when travelers passed by the Mitchell farm, they always talked about 2 things: the impossible garden that flourished in the middle of the desert, and the unlikely couple who had created an oasis of happiness where others saw only barren land. Shelby never dreamed of the delicate woman of her youthful fantasies again. Instead, he woke up every morning next to the strong, gentle woman who had chosen to share her life with him. Margaret had taught him that the best dreams are not those we imagine, but those that life surprises us to fulfill. And when the people of the region told the story of the small farmer and his giant wife, they always ended the same way: that true love is not measured in centimeters, but in the ability of 2 people to transform their differences into strength, their vulnerabilities into tenderness, and their broken dreams into something even more beautiful than they had dared to imagine. The wilderness around the Mitchell farm remained barren and unforgiving, but within the confines of the property, love had created its own climate, where even the most unlikely things could flourish under the care of 2 hearts that had finally found their home. If this unlikely love story between Shelby and Margaret has touched your heart, You can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West, where dreams transform in unexpected ways and true love blossoms in the most arid places. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment below telling us what was the most exciting moment of this story for you. It was the first meeting at the station, the kiss under the stars, or perhaps the miracle of the garden that bloomed in the desert, as well as the love between two lonely hearts that found their strength in the union of their differences.